We're really excited to bring together this great panel today for you to talk about our competency-based education policy map. Moderating today is Dr. Jonathan Moore from CCSSO, and we're thrilled to have him here to share the context that he's seeing more broadly across states. Lillian Pace from KnowledgeWorks, as well as Jonathan Alfuth and Emily Brixey, also here from KnowledgeWorks. They'll be popping into Q&A to answer the more research and wonky policy questions you may have, but we may also call on them as well throughout the conversation, depending on where we head. We are FullScale, the merged entity from the Learning Accelerator and the Aurora Institute. Really thrilled to have folks here on the webinar. Our mission is to unite education leaders and organizations together to drive collective learning, action, and systems transformation. And towards that end, we envision a world where every human reaches their full potential. We look forward to engaging the field in this work and so much more around policy, practice, and research. And now I am going to pass it off to Dr. Jonathan Moore, who's going to share a bit about how we got here in the conversation today. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It is a pleasure to be with you all today to discuss this important tool. I know that this tool was created as a project between KnowledgeWorks and FullScale, formerly known as the Aurora Institute. And as many of you may know on the call, both organizations have deep legacies in tracking state and federal policy related to student-centered education. And we know that they've both been at the forefront of synthesizing, sense-making, and offering expertise and guidance to states over the last couple of decades. About 15 years ago, only about half the states had policies in support of CBE on the books. When you fast forward to today, nearly every state has some sort of policy that supports competency-based implementation from waivers to pilots. That's certainly worth a round of applause, even in your silent space. Thank you. We know that this is a wonderful tool for state policymakers to dig deep into what this looks like across states and how they might apply similar work in their own contexts. I want to start by sharing a very short recording of the site functionality.
The State of CBE website allows policymakers, educators, advocates, leaders, and more to explore 8 policy levers focused on supporting competency-based education and learn whether each state has implemented that lever and how they've chosen to do so. The levers you can explore include whether the state has developed a state vision, such as a portrait or profile of a graduate, whether the state has developed a learning framework aligned to that portrait of a graduate, whether the state has developed graduation requirements aligned to the portrait of a graduate, whether the state has allowed students to earn credits towards graduation through demonstrations of competency, whether the state has defined instructional time to include out-of-school time or other student-centered activities, whether the state provides waivers for innovation, whether the state has competency-based education pilots or networks, and whether the state has provided funding to support the spread of competency-based education. Once you've decided which policy lever you'd like to learn about, you can click that policy lever from the drop-down menu. So for example, here, if we're interested in learning about whether or not a state has developed a learning framework aligned with its portrait of a graduate, you can click that drop-down to see the shaded states, which indicate that in fact that state does have a learning framework. So for example, here we see that North Dakota has a learning framework, and then you can click on the links on the right side of the screen to learn more about that specific framework. As you click around, you might also be able to find Go Deeper links, which are reports and blog posts by KnowledgeWorks or FullScale, where you can learn more about that state's specific work. You'll also, in some cases, see states that may not have that exact policy lever in place, but might have something similar or might have previously had that. So for example, if you look at the pilots and networks map, you'll see that states like North Dakota, Wyoming, and Colorado all have current pilots or networks in place. Then you'll see that a state like Iowa or Michigan previously had a program in place, but no longer does, or has something similar in place. We hope that you'll explore this website to learn more about the policy levers in place in your state and states across the country, and how you might be able to learn from what other states have done to spread the implementation of competency-based education. Thank you.
Wow, such a valuable tool. Not only is it informative, but also functional. And I'm a I appreciate visuals. And so the fact that there is a map, the fact that it's color coded, I think makes the tool that much more user friendly, which I'm excited to dig into. We're going to turn to our panelists for some conversation about the tool, but more importantly, about the work that the tool serves as a foundation of. So I'd like to kick it off to Jennifer first. Can you start with telling us what is the goal, what was the goal behind building this map? And walk us through how you decided to partner with KnowledgeWorks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jonathan. So folks here probably know that FullScale, formerly Aurora, has been maintaining a map tracking state policy developments around competency-based education since 2011. As Jonathan mentioned before, back then, fewer than half the states were on the map at all. But as of 2023, all 50 states were there, Wyoming being the final state to join us. But unfortunately, the level of detail in that map and the actionable information that was captured there was fairly limited. So in late 2024, we sat down with KnowledgeWorks. We're two organizations with great reputations in the field and, of course, brilliant researchers to back the map up, and really committed to developing a new map that would have a higher level of granularity, backed by receipts. How do we know this is true? Where can we learn more? That state leaders, advocates, other education stakeholders from parents to educators can go to both understand what policies are currently in place to support CBE in their states, and also how they can learn from other states that have done work that they hope to do. And then look literally at their legislative language, look at their regulatory and statutory language to see how they could do something similar. So we think of it as like a self-generating tool for future work in CBE.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. And as I'm listening to you outline all of the multifaceted uses for the tool, especially in with regard to informing policy, did you have a particular audience in mind when you were designing the tool?
I think that there's a lot of possibilities here. We think the core audience are really state leaders who are looking to do this work in their states or to learn about how they can grow it from where they are. So great example, states that have a portrait of a graduate and are saying, well, what do we do now? How do we move this from poster into practice? They can then look at states that have developed learning frameworks, states that have started to iterate on their graduation requirements, for example. But there's really possibilities for advocates, for educators on the ground also to go and see, I want to try something new. What's possible in my state? It turns out the vast majority of states, for example, have waiver policies that give their district leaders or their school leaders or their classroom leaders the opportunity to innovate and try new things. We know it's not an if you build it, they will come sort of in undertaking. Waivers are sometimes onerous and often insufficient to really get the spread of CBE, but they're a great place for a lot of places to start. And it's very likely that a lot of district and school leaders don't even know that they exist in their state. So that's another opportunity as well.
Absolutely. And so if I just think about as you walked us through sort of the origin of this tool and how it can be used and even the audience, let's start to dig a little bit behind the tool. Lillian, I want to turn to you. So we know that both of your organizations, FullScale KnowledgeWorks, have been tracking competency-based education for a decade, the better part of a decade for sure. Can you walk us through what are some of the takeaways or headlines from the past decade from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And for those who are not familiar with KnowledgeWorks, we are a nonprofit organization that really partners with both practitioners and policymakers to design the future of learning. And we have focused, as Dr. Moore shared, very heavily on personalized and competency-based learning over the past decade. And in doing so, we have been tracking policies and trying to get a sense of those trends, what are the highest leverage policies. From that, there's a tremendous amount to be learned. As Jennifer shared, there have been a lot of policies enacted throughout that decade. I think one of the first big reflections that I would share is when we started this work at KnowledgeWorks, there were so many conversations that came to us that were really oriented around this notion of, as a state leader, how do I create some space for my innovative districts that want to do this work? I trust in them. I believe in them. I know they want to do something that is really compelling and transformative for their students, but I don't know if my whole state is ready for this. And that's where you saw such an increase in policies to create these waiver programs. So if you had an innovative district, there was a mechanism that they could use to really test out and try something different. over the course of time, we actually began to see a shift away from this notion of just a waiver to enable a few innovative districts to conversations from state leaders that say, we actually believe this is probably the right approach for students. And so we need to figure out how to shift our entire system. And that is very complex work because this is soup to nuts. It touches every issue in the policy sandbox, right? And so this is complex stuff. The other kind of big headline that happened over the past decade was the COVID pandemic. And if you want to talk about an enabler for removing policy barriers that were really written in a traditional lens, that was it. So many states had to go into emergency sessions and begin to think differently about things like the definitions of instructional time, and we started to see all sorts of, temporary waivers put into place to deal with that emergency. That then when we finally started to regroup and come back in, all of a sudden policymakers were looking at those lists of things that they waived and beginning to say there was some value in waiving that. And what could we imagine for our education system if we actually kept that in place and made it a possibility as we rebuild our education systems in a post-COVID environment? So that was a tremendous enabler. The other thing that I would really flag is we are now sort of seeing a lot of interest in competency-based education because there is a need to kind of reframe the value of public schooling. There's a massive relevance gap in this country. And so there is an interest at addressing, not only filling kind of those learning gaps that existed within the COVID pandemic, but also starting to make learning fun again, to really engage and design it around students. And so the interest has become really profound from stakeholders at all levels of the system. And now it's just getting into the weeds, right? Of how do you dismantle all the old statutes and regulations and codes that were put in place under one traditional system and rebuild it in a more student-centered orientation. So all really positive areas to flag from a momentum standpoint.
Thanks, Lillian. So I'm hearing in terms of headlines, the systemic approach to the work, creating more relevancy, but also you mentioned what really stood out to me is how many contexts leverage the impact of COVID to create flexibilities or to really examine the systemic impact. Jennifer, I'm curious if you have any additional headlines to offer from your perspective around competency-based education policy over the last decade.
Absolutely. I think that this is uniquely linked as well. But what the pandemic really brought out is that families, leaders, learners, the business community, they're hungry for education systems to be doing things differently than they've done them for the first 100 years. We've been really iterating on the margins in a big way for the last 30 years or so, with some pretty limited impact on the way that school looks and feels generation over generation. And the recent NAEP scores are additionally motivating, right? We know that we're not at all where we need to be. And business leaders, of course, have been ringing that bell around durable skills for quite a while now, saying this is something we need the K-12 system to care about so that we can reach our goals and really make good on our future economically as well. I mentioned before that CBE is not an if you build it, they will come, like the waivers. And one of the big headlines for us is that to really get CBE going in meaningful ways, there are additional moves that we need states to be making to ensure that CBE is implemented with high fidelity and high quality. And that's where you start to see things like investments in professional learning coming out of states like we saw in Washington, investments in technical assistance like we saw in Wyoming, for example. So there's more work to be done to really get there. The waivers are a sort of first start. The portrait of a graduate, those are really a reflection of that push towards identifying what we want students to know and be able to do when they graduate, and not just academically, but beyond that as well. So these are all sort of movements that come out of this ongoing conversation we've had about what our students really deserve and what we need to get to the next stage.
And Jennifer, you were starting to hone in a little bit on competing priorities. We know states are grappling with many things. And so when we think about advancing CBE, especially when there may be this appearance of competing priorities, as Lee mentioned, it's a systemic perspective. how do you, or what's your message to states who are feeling as if advancing CBE may be at the expense of another priority, or maybe at sort of the misalignment of another priority?
Yeah, I love this question because it comes up a lot. There is this tension, but we fundamentally believe that CBE, when done effectively, is in service of core academic skills like literacy and math by increasing student agency and therefore engagement, unlocking authentic assessments, connecting academics to real world problems, all practices that we know are backed by learning sciences, right? There's lots of research that says this is how learning should occur. This is how kids learn best. States can really effectively support their goals to achieve academic excellence and support their students in getting there. So I'd really encourage states to not think of this as a either or something in tension, but that CBE can really be in service of those core academic goals. And we've seen that exact motivation from states like Washington. They came out and said, we have a significant student engagement problem. How can we address that? And they, through research, through lots of thought, through task forces, identified CBE as the policy area that they really wanted to dive into to address that engagement and therefore address their academic goals. And we've already seen FullScale has the pleasure of being the third-party evaluator on that work. It's the Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative. And we've already seen positive impacts on school climate, cultural responsiveness, and student engagements, all early indicators of academic achievement.
That's very helpful, Jennifer. Lillian, I actually want to turn the same question over to you in terms of what's your message to states who are feeling as if they have to navigate competing priorities when it comes to CBE?
Yeah, so the headline here is, competency-based education. It's not a content area, it's an approach. It's an approach to learning. And I think sometimes, particularly in our policy communities, we often, see policymakers that get really excited about a new idea and it becomes kind of a siloed off effort instead of thinking about the systemic approach of competency-based education. And we are starting to see states think that way, as Jennifer shared. I wanted to, really celebrate and lift up North Dakota. In this last legislative session, they actually passed a new program to help students in 4th through 8th grade attain competency in mathematics. It was a state that is extremely concerned, about the NAEP scores, and they've been looking at the gaps around math. It's also a state that's been one of, the national leaders in advancing competency-based education systems, and they knew those pieces go hand in hand. Math is a subject area that builds, right? And so if you have a student who advances with a gap in a particular content area in mathematics, that gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And a competency-based approach actually provides that scaffolding to make sure that every student has mastered the content before they move on. So in North Dakota now, they're going to provide that screening to identify those gaps, and they're going to be able to provide those personalized competency-based interventions in order to make sure that those students are met where they are, that they receive the personalized tutoring, and that they are able to close those gaps and attain competency. So we don't have to think about these as separate. We should be thinking about them in a very integrated way.
And that message certainly rings true from both you and Jennifer. You both have started to highlight some state examples to illustrate not only the importance, but ways in which states are advancing CBE. Lillian, I want to start with you. Can you talk to us a little bit about the state policy levers? I believe there are 8 of these. Can you talk to us about their origins and sort of why they matter?
Yeah. Well, and this goes back to the beauty of the partnership between FullScale and KnowledgeWorks. Both of our organizations have been doing this work deeply for more than a decade around competency-based education. So it won't be a surprise to know that when we got together and compared our state policy frameworks, they were extremely aligned. The work that we were tracking is the same work that FullScale was tracking. And so this was a fabulous opportunity for us to come together and say, what are the areas where we are seeing the most momentum and excitement from policymakers? Because we want to tell that story. That's really important. But also, what are the policy areas that we think have the highest potential to really jumpstart this movement and to really enable those district leaders? And we wanted to start there. We have learned a lot as we've studied sort of the state's movement in this area, and we have started to, I would never say there's one path that every state should go down. Obviously, we are the people in personalized learning, right? We recognize the need for local context, but there is some sort of semblance around a typical sequence that we start to see, at least in the early stages of this work. So this initial set of maps is really meant to honor and lift up the story that our two organizations are seeing as we are beginning to track those policies.
Thanks, Lillian. And Jennifer, I want to turn the same question over to you slightly. So, in thinking about the map in itself and the 8 areas, are there any that stand out? Or if you're a state looking at these, is there a prioritized order? Or what would be an entry point into one of the areas?
Great question. So I think one thing everyone on the call can agree on is that change in education of any variety is really hard. And it starts really with getting buy-in from all of the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are vast. And so what we've seen a lot of states start with is the development of a shared vision. And they've typically done that by engaging the full set of stakeholders: education leaders, families, students, educators, business community, the religious community, sort of the whole of all of those affected by the outcomes of the education system, and engage them in a process of identifying what are the broader set of skills or the broader aims that we want students when they graduate our system to know and be able to do. And that document typically gets called something like a portrait of a graduate or a portrait of a learner. And then from that, we see a lot of the follow-on work trickle down. So we see the learning frameworks come out. We see alignment with graduation requirements. We see alignment, even like a state like Kentucky is starting to look at how they can connect their portrait of a graduate with their accountability system. This is like the next horizon of the work that we're really excited about and seeing momentum there as there's more flexibility. But as Lillian said, there really is no like one right way. So we've seen some folks, and this is not yet reflected in the map, but we hope for it to be in the future. Some states really look at alignment between their K-12 CTE higher ed and workforce systems and how they can build really meaningful, powerful pathways that put students on the direction towards a really fruitful life of lifelong learning through those pathways in thoughtful ways. That often requires a lot: longevity of leadership, staffing, funding, really thoughtful design. But that's another set of work that we're really excited about. And per Lillian's point, these are just our 8 first levers. There is a much broader set of maps that we would love to be able to develop that includes that. And I see some chatter in the Q&A around where we're seeing sort of out of school time and work-based learning experiences come in. That's a big one. Rethinking accountability and also rethinking assessment are 2 really ripe areas for more maps. So would love to be able to do that in the future too.
That's helpful, Jennifer. And I think you're in my mind with the next question. I was going to talk about what patterns are you seeing. So you started to talk about portrait of a learner sort of then giving way to other movement across the system. And you mentioned, of course, Kentucky exploring their portrait with their accountability system. Are there any other patterns or connections you're seeing?
Yeah, so we talked about this a bit briefly before, but I think it's worth delving into this idea. I call it like going from poster to practice. So once you've done the really hard work of getting everyone on board to create your vision, your portrait of a graduate or learner or whatever a state might call it, the rubber meets the road when you start to develop the learning frameworks, the alignment with with graduation requirements and everything else. That's really hard work. It requires the state to have a long-term commitment to do that. And as I mentioned also before, it requires things like longevity of leadership, of staffing in a certain way. Historically, state education agencies have really been designed for compliance. Designing those agencies in new ways that lead towards the development of new instructional models, for example, is a real shift in both culture and in structure of those agencies. So we've seen a lot of these things sort of happen in iterative. It's sort of like, you drop the puddle into the pond and you see the waves come out. And so we've seen that happen in states like Utah, North Dakota, Kentucky, Indiana, and we're still riding the ripples out. So that's been exciting to see. Another one that I think is worth calling up is the sort of growth in CBE pilots and network and funding. That comes of that realization that to really do this well, states need to invest not only in the work itself, but also in the learning that comes from the work and being really thoughtful of what comes next. So we've seen states like Washington and Wyoming investing a bit in evaluating the impact of the work too. And we're excited for what those stories can tell other states as well for how to do this in effective and new ways. And it also engages or requires, I think, worth stating, often the engagement of technical assistance providers, sort of third parties that can help support the work. KnowledgeWorks has played that role in some states, and they're lucky to be able to partner with states in that way. But it really is an effort that goes beyond a couple people in a state agency.
So we're hearing this communal approach to the work, engaging multiple stakeholders. Lillian, similar question to you. What patterns or connections are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, so I want to start by kind of recalling back my reflection on the past decade, right? If we think about that past decade as one that was really emphasis on permissible policies, as I'll call them, like we're not writing policies for the whole country, but we're enabling, a few districts who might want to do this work. Combined with kind of this COVID emergency, moment where we waived a bunch of things, we are at a moment now where there's so many policies on the books that districts can leverage in really powerful ways. And yet we are not seeing the uptake in the field in the ways in which policymakers would have hoped when they had created those policies. So kind of one of my big kind of ahas or interconnectedness is you can look at all of these maps and begin to think about, wow, that state must be doing unbelievable work. And the reality is when you get down into the ground, it's still in pockets. So there's going to be a need for some intentional strategies around the policy implementation space in order to help our districts really take advantage of what is already on the books. The other thing about this sort of permissible policies lens is that means that those district innovators who are really thinking outside the box and pushing the envelope, they're doing that on their own. And so that has actually given rise to the need for more networks, local networks of districts. And so we're seeing that emerge. And one of the areas that we have in our maps really starts to celebrate, like where we are seeing these networks emerge all over the country. That has been a capacity building strategy. So that's going to be extremely important to think about as well. I would also say that, there's an interesting lesson to think about between the significant number of states that have changed the way they're thinking about instructional time to be more student-centered, whether that means learning experiences that are happening outside of the classroom, think like a work-based learning experience, combined with this flexibilities that are emerging around graduation requirements. That's naturally bringing questions to bear right now around, so how do we then actually start to think differently about these traditional course sequences, right? So in statute, we've always said, every student needs to take this certain number of courses, right? And it looks very one size fits all until you get to the kind of very end of the high school continuum. There's a little bit of flexibility to do some fun stuff. So now we're starting to see states ask that question, like if we have these flexibilities, how do we also now start to think differently about how to create these kind of rich and vibrant pathways? We've seen, Indiana begin to do this with their, new graduation requirements and diplomas and the seals that they're building in. So there is more flexibility for students in their course taking patterns. And we've seen North Dakota do this by passing a mastery-based framework that says, like, if you're a local school board and you can propose an alternative way for your students to demonstrate mastery of this state learning framework, bring it to us and let's see how you can really reimagine learning for your students. So that's going to be an interesting trend, I think, to watch going forward.
That's very helpful. And I think what you touch on initially, the idea of there's this disconnect, right? Several policies on the books, but when it comes to implementation, often limited, often varied or stifled. Jennifer, I want to turn to you really quickly. When we talk about this disconnect, what does it look like, or in what ways can a state begin to advance CBE if there's no shared learning framework? Or is that possible? Is that an option?
It's certainly possible. We've seen states take a couple different pathways here. In some cases, they sort of put the onus on their districts and say, we've got this portrait of a graduate, go figure out your learning framework. That can sometimes be really rejuvenating for districts who really believe in that local control effort. And you've seen some of them run with it. It is a very onerous process and it requires a level of expertise and an amount of time that a lot of folks may not actually have at the district level. And some state agencies also don't have, which is, I think, part of why you don't see tons of states on the map currently have with learning frameworks, even though they've got the portraits of a graduate. I think it's something like 19 have portraits of a graduate, but only 6 have learning frameworks or something like that. So it's quite a significant drop off. And I think in the places where you do see those learning frameworks, it's places where they have, and I mentioned this before, but the longevity of leadership and that real deep commitment to CBE, not just to sort of unlocking this broader set of aims that we want students to know and be able to do, but a belief that they need to fundamentally change the way teaching and learning looks in the state. And they've done that through the Portrait of a Graduate and the Learning Framework. And often they also have a CBE pilot or a network or a funding system. And they've also thought really hard about their graduation requirements and things like that. So that's where you start to see it happening at a more systemic level. Lillian said this before, but I think it's worth restating. Like CBE is not just like one piece of the puzzle that you drop in. It's fundamentally rethinking what the puzzle of your education system looks like. It's not just a waiver, but it's a whole series of policy moves that need to be made, of which learning frameworks are one. You can attack it from other angles as well, but I think there's an argument to be made that if you're talking about what teaching and learning really looks like in the classroom, getting to the learning framework is going to eventually be a necessary piece of the puzzle.
Well, I think that's great to start there. Learning framework, essential piece of the puzzle. So, if you're a state looking to embark upon this systemic implementation of advancing CBE, what are some of the first steps you would recommend a state would take? We'll start with Jennifer and then we'll go to Lillian. I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I think we got to this a little bit before, which is this idea of change is hard and getting people on board is the first step. So I do think we've seen at this point a lot of states really start with that development of the portrait of a graduate, because that is sort of the set of beliefs or the North Star, if you will, from which a lot of the other work flows. We've also seen states start in other directions. So Alabama is a great example where they've really gone all in on the pathways and breaking down the silos. That's come in large part because they have oh gosh, I can't remember if it's a superintendent or a commissioner, but also a very strong governor's office there
Superintendent.
as well. Thank you, superintendent. Appreciate that. But a very strong governor's office that's led a lot of that work. And they've been in office for, gosh, almost a decade, I believe. So it's exciting to see what's possible when you have that sort of political will and capital to move the work there. But Lillian, I'm going to open the floor for you to come in from a different angle.
Yeah, so I would naturally underscore what you say. You got to start at the visioning place. You have to get the buy-in. We are dealing with so many changes in our economy and our education systems, and it is extremely important to re-engage a conversation around what does readiness mean for our students for the next stage of life. And so in order to get clarity around what we need to do to prepare our students for the world in which they're entering into, then that scaffolds in to how we think about all of the different levels of the system that need to be redesigned. But I would be remiss if I didn't say this as a policy person. Like, we have to get under the hood and do a policy audit. Like, there are just so many old policy language and systems that need to be decoded, so to speak, right? Through this lens of a new sort of competency-based orientation. There are going to be provisions in law that I said can be leveraged right now. Like, it doesn't take a massive undertaking to get political will and pass new things. Sometimes you can do a lot with what you already have in place. And so the first step is like getting under the hood and trying to identify your assets that you can leverage, but also what just needs to change, and to begin to go through sort of a prioritization process around which of those policy barriers you want to begin to shift. Because so many states have been at this work for a long time now, there's just a rich rich body to learn from. I'm going to give a shout out to Dr. Moore, your organization, and the Student Centered Learning Collaborative that you guys have in place. This is an opportunity for states to come and learn together and to really share the hard work that each of you are doing in this space. When we work with states, that is the number one thing they are hungry for, is tell me how another state approached this. What are the pros and cons of their approach? What were the lessons that they learned, right? And so while every context is unique and local, there's so much that can be learned from studying from others in that area. Just some advice too that I was kind of reflecting on as I was thinking about this. I know I've talked a lot about kind of the permissible policies and that approach sort of being kind of the starting place. I don't hate it. I actually think it's a good thing not to mandate right out the gate. When you are starting something new, it is important to create some space and then to build the capacity of your field to do that work really well. And once you are at a place where you're feeling good about the capacity, then you can start to have conversations about how to make that change writ large. So I actually kind of like the move to, make graduation requirements flexible. So think about like the state of Colorado, where they have kind of this menu of options for their graduation approach. You can do a more traditional path, but you can also do a non-traditional competency-based approach. And so you have a choice as a district, and you can study and learn from other districts who are taking different paths within that approach before you make a decision as a state, if you ever decide to do something writ large. So I think not mandating is going to be really critical. And then just the last thing I'll say, I always believe it is so critical. Any policymaking work needs to be done with the field. And so creating those networks that are learning in real time with the policymakers, you creating those feedback loops, that's the best way that you're going to create the efficient policymaking cycles.
If I can jump in and add one thing, because Lillian, you said when you were talking about the policy audit, I think there's this concept that I learned about a couple of years ago that I love, which is the idea of ghost policies and zombie policies. And ghost policies are policies that exist, but people don't know about them. And then zombie policies are policies that don't exist, but people are haunted by them. Like they think that they exist and they're following them around. And in both cases, the ghost policies are keeping people from unlocking new practices, and the zombie policies are scaring people away from trying anything because they think that these restrictions exist that don't actually. And so that policy audit can really get you to the point not only of what does exist that needs to go away, but also what are the perceptions that people have about what's out there but isn't, and how can you systematically start to address those barriers as well.
I love that, Jennifer. Ghost and zombie policies. Love a good metaphor. I think we have time for one more question in this part of our conversation. And so I really want to turn to you to both of you to help us wrap things up. So thinking about the next big policy areas that are on the horizon, we've talked a lot about state leaders, rightfully so. But as you think about other partners in the ecosystem, funders, community-based partners, what advice do you have for them as we think about what's next? We'll start with Jennifer and then turn it over to Lillian.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. So as we know, and as we've talked about this whole time, CBE has significant momentum in a lot of states. And we've seen those states that are diving in are really diving in and making multi-year long-term commitments. But there are other states that have really barely begun to examine its promise, even when they have districts that have committed very deeply. So there's in some cases, a deep disconnect between a district level policy and what's happening in the state in which they operate. And a large part of this, I think, is because there's limited evidence base for the impact of CBE on student outcomes. It's very backed by learning sciences, but we don't yet have those long-term, like RCT style, SL level 2 studies showing the real impact on the student outcomes. And that's a tremendous opportunity to build out the evidence base. So I would recommend investing there. It would be a significant contribution to the field. I think the other piece that is really missing is this idea of what are the core moves that a state really needs to make to ensure high quality CBE implementation. And there's two pieces of that. One is saying, what does high quality CBE implementation really look and feel like at the classroom and school level? And then what were the enabling conditions that happened in the state that district or school operates in to make that possible. And then, per Lillian's point before, can we spread that information to more states so they know where they should be putting their energy and where maybe they shouldn't be? Because there's just so much more that states that can be learning from each other, and we've not yet fully unlocked the promise there, I don't think.
Lillian.
All right. So I got to think about my last words, right? Where do you place your bets? So a lot of people are thinking about the fact that with the economy changing so rapidly, with the rise of artificial intelligence, we know that we have to figure out a way to make sure our students are mastering knowledge and skills. That is just a new norm. We have to figure out a way to do that. And that is going to require a tremendous amount of work to sort of right size our learning frameworks. And so, what do I mean by that? We have a tremendous amount of academic standards that we know are absolutely critical for our students to master. We're also now saying that they need to be proficient in these skills that are going to be so important to the workforce. What does that mean as an educator? You can't just put more on the system, right? So how am I going to smartly connect and integrate these two pieces in a really meaningful way through my learning frameworks all the way down my system? That is something that's going to be so important for us to figure out. And then related to that, how are we going to validate that students have mastered, right, the knowledge and the skills? And that is a complete paradigm shift from where we have been for the past 20 plus years in K-12 education. So I would say that's going to be an extremely important area that we need to figure out so we don't overwhelm a system that already feels pretty overwhelmed. The second area, and for folks who know me, you'll know I have to talk about assessments. This has been an area that, despite, kind of as you reflect back and think about the past decade, we talk to our partners in the field, they would put like assessments right up there as like, they're just not aligned with a competence-based approach. And despite a lot of like attempted effort over the past decade, we just haven't made as much progress as we would have liked to have made in that area. And so that continues to be a big pain point. What I will say, though, that feels different right now is that because we are seeing such rapid advances in technology, how we design assessments can look very different now. We can bring a customization, a personalization, because technology is enabling us to do so in a high quality way in ways we haven't been able to do before. And so that's incredibly encouraging. I also think that there is, the assessment conversation is so intertwined between the federal and the state levels. And I do think there is an openness to think about how the federal and state levels can partner more. We're hearing a lot of narrative about states leading, right? So this could be a compelling moment, I think, for our states to come forward with new ideas for how they do want to tackle and design assessment systems that are truly aligned to competency-based approaches. The last piece I will underscore, also a lot of rhetoric, a lot of excitement and interest around workforce readiness. And, I know John Alfuth on our team, he's probably smirking to hear me say this, but there's kind of this frustrating silo between like the CTE world, right, and the competency-based world, and yet they're literally anchored in the exact same principles. And if we want to get back to addressing that relevancy gap, right, that we know is so critical, why do we have siloed systems? Why don't we figure out a way to integrate CTE and our competency-based approach to education so that every single student benefits from that career-connected learning experiences as we think about how to redesign learning pathways? So that's going to be an absolutely critical area, I think, to focus on going forward.
Wow, well, you both have given us quite a bit to consider and to think about. So this concludes this portion of our conversation. Next, we'll move into some Q&A from the audience. While people are processing and getting their questions in the chat, one that I did see, which sparked my interest, Jennifer and Lillian, was around, and you had ended your comment, Lillian, with workforce. And so there was one in there about, and I'm going to rephrase it a certain way, but what are certain considerations when we think about educator preparation and how CBE fits into that. We often, talk about obviously in-service teachers, but when we think of how we're preparing educators and also school and systems leaders, what are some key considerations there? And we'll turn it over to Lillian and Jennifer to kind of kick us off while we invite other questions from the audience.
Lillian, if I can jump in on this one, because this is one of my favorite topics. So I think there's sort of a two-piece conversation to really preparing, particularly pre-service teachers for a competency-based system. And it's first, what competency-based experiences are educators having in their pre-service to experience what it's like as a student so that they can provide that for themselves. So I used to run the Educator Micro-Credentials Initiative at Digital Promise, where we were trying to build exactly that system, giving educators opportunities to show what they know and receive meaningful recognition for that, rather than engaging in CEUs and other things that were not competency-based, for example. And so there's this fundamental belief that once an educator experiences competency-based learning themselves, then they're better able to provide it for their students. So I do think there's opportunity to think about how we can redesign teacher preparation programs to be competency-based in and of themselves. And we see some systems already doing that. WGU is a great example of that. The other side of it is, how are we preparing educators to go from being sort of the sage on the stage in the classroom to being a facilitator or a coach of learning? Because that's how we see a lot of more advanced CBE systems shifting the role of the educator in the classroom, and also thinking about what it looks like more broadly. So how does an educator have the time and the space to develop those personalized pathways for individual students based on their interests, and shaping the learning experiences accordingly, right? It requires an educator to really occupy a different role in the classroom. And that is a whole area of teacher preparation that is starting to come up in often sort of alternative pathway programs. But I believe there's a lot of work that we can be doing in partnership with traditional TPPs, EPPs, to really push the envelope there, because we have a long way to go. We already know we have teacher shortages. We see cool programs like district-based residency programs coming up to sort of address those gaps. But if we want to do it at a systemic level, we have to start working hand in hand with the traditional systems as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm hearing innovation all throughout your response to the question, right? How do we think differently, and how do we think differently to meet the current moment? Lillian, we have another question that has come through. This one's in relation to assessments. It says, additionally, is anyone using performance assessments through state innovation waivers, either in addition to traditional summative or place of? So what are you seeing in the assessment landscape?
Yeah, great question. And thank you so much for asking that. It's important, I think, to know that the reason we see such an interest for performance assessment within the competency-based education space is because a competency-based approach, it does get at these higher order thinking skills that go beyond kind of that sort of surface level memorization that you tend to see happening more around a standardized assessment. So typically, to have a better alignment with the system, you want a deeper assessment experience so that students can demonstrate these transferable concepts that they have grasped and are going to stay with them far beyond the time that they've studied for a particular assessment experience. The areas that we have seen the most innovation, so to speak, around performance assessment have actually been outside of the federal space. And again, that's highly tied to sort of more robust technical quality requirements at the federal level that make it much more challenging to do so. I will say where we have seen the most innovation would be first in the graduation requirements space. So I think I mentioned Colorado earlier as a state that presented a sort of a menu of options, one of which is a performance assessment experience that a district can create in order to have a student demonstrate mastery and readiness for post-graduation experiences. The other area is in non-federally tested subjects. So that means not your math, English language arts, or science, but actually in subjects like history, civics, writing. My home state of Virginia actually passed a state board regulation to require every single district to develop a performance assessment in a non-tested subject. And then the state legislature actually repealed some of the required state level testing in those subjects to create space for that more authentic performance assessment to emerge. So we are seeing some movement in those areas. I do want to give a shout out to Massachusetts, though, on the federal front. They have really paved the way on a hard path to try to figure out how to do some of this. So they've received an Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority waiver to pilot performance assessment tasks in science. In 5th and 8th grades, I believe. And the idea there was that Massachusetts was top of the nation in the MCAS assessments, like they were doing everything right. So it seems then they did that hard sort of reflective work of looking at their instructional program and realized that it was really shifting to be more sort of surface level and away from some of those deeper learning tasks that they knew were critical to prepare their students for the future. And that was because the test was changing the behaviors of the instructional experience. So they decided to start with science and pilot initially, and this year, I believe now every student in the state of Massachusetts will be taking performance tasks in science in 5th and 8th grade. And this is a technology based platform where students are coming in and they are conducting their own simulation. So they're going to run data sets, they're going to manipulate them, they're going to conduct their own analysis, and they're going to answer questions based on that that include long form responses that the computers are going to be able to grade. So kind of a really interesting step forward through the federal lens, and hopefully a sign that other states may try to follow suit.
Thank you. We have an additional question. This was in relation to our corporate partners in the education landscape. Have you seen examples where major corporate partners, especially in the education technology space, have incorporated mastery dashboards or similar functionality in their platforms?
I can jump in there a bit. I don't know if I could say those big major LMSs have done mastery dashboards per se. I know that most of them have digital badging technology built into them. And that is actually a real, per my point about micro-credentials earlier, a real interesting functionality as a way for a school to sort of dip a toe into competency-based credentialing of skills, because digital badging allows a learner to submit evidence of a specific granular skill, have that evidence assessed, and then receive a portable badge that could go both in their LMS, but also on their LinkedIn or on their resume or whatever else that has underlying data that shows what they submitted to demonstrate that competency. That exists in a lot of LMSs today, and we've seen school districts start to use that as sort of an entry point. Often micro-credentials are more powerfully used for the durable skills than the academic skills because they're observable in different ways. There's a really interesting organization out of Maine called Jobs for Maine Graduates, who I believe they use one of the major LMSs to facilitate their sort of statewide micro-credential program that's focused on workforce skills and how learners in K-12 can develop those skills over time. So we are seeing some movement there. There are also some really interesting smaller technologies out there, like Mastery Transcript Consortium is a really common one, where they have sort of from the beginning started with designing for a mastery dashboard. And then per the question below that from Scott, one of the interesting outcomes is MTC has actually gotten 700, I believe, colleges and universities to accept their mastery transcript in place of a traditional high school transcript. So it shows that with the right sort of communication in place, you can get acceptance among major institutions, universities, and colleges for a mastery-based diploma as opposed to one that focuses on courses and grades.
That's fantastic. And also encouraging. Not where we want to be, but we're on our way and on the path. I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. And so before I turn it over to Jennifer to close us out, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to moderate this conversation. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, this map is a valuable tool that's going to help a number of states, no matter where you're situated, no matter where you sit in the ecosystem, to be able to advance CBE. And I think what's encouraging about this webinar that FullScale and KnowledgeWorks have co-hosted is that even seen here in the chat, so many states are highlighting the work that's transpired in alignment with the focus areas on the map. And so that's really great to see the momentum and the work that is happening. Once again, thank you so much for having me as your host for this session. Jennifer, do you have any closing remarks for the webinar?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you to Lillian and Emily and John, who are just doing tremendous work in the Q&A, providing folks with resources. I hope that you'll continue to use them as a resource and to use the policy map. And then if I can get the next slide, I wanted to make a quick push. We will be gathering the full field in CBE and education transformation beyond at the end of the month in New Orleans. I have a gut feeling that many of you will already planning to be there, but if not, we hope that you will join us. It will be a tremendous opportunity of learning and joy and coming together as leaders in the field to celebrate what we've done and dream about what can be possible next. So thank you all so much for attending. Looking forward to continuing the conversation with you all.